When Grace Kimani, a 42-year-old African housekeeper earning $18 per hour cleaning the luxury Manhattan penthouse of billionaire Thomas Wellington III, quietly endured her employer's son cutting her hair with scissors while she cleaned the Persian rugs, she had no idea that in just 48 hours she would be sitting across from Thomas at his mahogany desk, holding documents that would transform her from an invisible domestic worker into the new owner of his $500 million real estate empire. How did a woman who spoke broken English and slept in a single room in Queens manage to completely destroy the Wellington family dynasty using nothing but her smartphone and a secret she had been hiding for 8 years? This is the story of Grace Kimani, the African immigrant who went from being humiliated by racist teenagers to becoming the most powerful real estate mogul in New York City, proving that the biggest mistake wealthy families make is underestimating the people they treat as invisible. Thomas Wellington III adjusted his $5,000 Italian silk tie as he stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 40th floor penthouse overlooking Central Park. At 48 years old, he was everything Manhattan elite aspired to be. Harvard MBA, inherited fortune worth $800 million, and the kind of old money arrogance that came from 5 generations of Wellington family wealth. His steel gray eyes surveyed the city below, like a king viewing his kingdom. The Wellington name was carved into half the buildings in Manhattan's financial district, and Thomas wore that legacy like armor against any criticism or challenge to his authority. His wife Margaret, 45, perfectly coiffed blonde hair never out of place, spent her days at charity galas and shopping on Fifth Avenue. She had married into the Wellington fortune 15 years ago and had molded herself into the perfect society wife, beautiful, compliant, and completely dependent on Thomas's approval and money. Their son Brandon, 16, was a carbon copy of his father's arrogance without any of the business acumen that had built the Wellington empire. He attended Manhattan's most exclusive private school, where his $200 sneakers and unlimited credit card made him feel invincible among his equally privileged classmates. The Wellington family lived in a world where people like Grace Kimani were meant to be invisible, efficient, quiet, and grateful for whatever scraps of employment they could find. Grace Kimani arrived at the Wellington penthouse every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 6 a.m., taking 3 different subway trains from her cramped studio apartment in Queens. At 42, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that years of financial struggle hadn't managed to break. Her dark skin showed the premature aging of someone who had worked double shifts for over a decade, sending every spare dollar back to her sick mother in Nairobi and paying for her younger sister's medical school in Kenya. She spoke English with a heavy accent that made wealthy Americans assume she was uneducated, and she had learned to make herself as invisible as possible while working in their homes. What the Wellingtons didn't know was that Grace had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Nairobi, with degrees in international finance and real estate law. She had spent 5 years as a senior analyst at Kenya's largest investment firm before her mother's sudden illness forced her to abandon her career and emigrate to the United States for better-paying work. The woman they paid $18 an hour to scrub their toilets and vacuum their hand-woven carpets could analyze complex financial documents in her sleep and spoke 4 languages fluently, including Mandarin Chinese, which she had learned during her graduate studies in international commerce. But in America, her degrees meant nothing without expensive recertification, and she needed money immediately, not years later after jumping through bureaucratic hoops. So Grace Kimani, former investment analyst, became Grace Kimani, invisible domestic worker, swallowing her pride every day as she cleaned the homes of people who wouldn't bother learning how to pronounce her name correctly. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Grace was methodically cleaning the Wellingtons' living room, carefully moving around the $50,000 antique coffee table and the original Picasso hanging above their white leather couch. She had developed a system over her 2 years working for the family. Start early, work efficiently, avoid interaction with family members whenever possible. Mrs. Wellington usually slept until 10 a.m. Mr. Wellington left for his office by 7 a.m., and their son Brandon was supposed to be getting ready for school. Grace was on her hands and knees, carefully cleaning the intricate patterns of the massive Persian rug that dominated the living room, when she heard footsteps behind her. She looked up to see Brandon Wellington, still in his expensive pajamas, holding a pair of kitchen scissors and wearing a smirk that made her stomach tighten with unease. "My mom says your hair looks messy," Brandon said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that came from 16 years of never being told no. "She thinks it would look better shorter." The thick braids that had taken her 4 hours to style the night before fell to the expensive rug in dark coils. Grace froze in shock, her mind struggling to comprehend that this teenage boy was actually cutting her hair like she was some kind of toy for his amusement. "Stop," Grace whispered, her accent heavy with emotion. "Please stop. Besides, you work for us, so we can do whatever we want." Maybe this will teach her to take better care of her appearance. She had worked through the flu, missed her sister's graduation via video call because she couldn't afford to take time off, and sent pictures of their family vacations to her sick mother in Nairobi because she thought Americans were all kind and successful. The hair continued falling. Brandon was cutting it so short in some places that her scalp showed through, creating an uneven, humiliating mess that would take months to repair. Grace's braids had been her pride, the one thing about her appearance that she spent time and money maintaining because they connected her to her heritage and her grandmother, who had taught her the intricate braiding patterns. "There," Brandon finally said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Much better. Now you look more professional." 2 years of growth, hours of careful styling, and her connection to her grandmother's traditions lay scattered on the floor like garbage. Her reflection in the living room's mirror showed a woman who looked like she had been attacked. Patches of hair missing, uneven lengths, and the hollow look in her eyes of someone whose dignity had just been stripped away for entertainment. Margaret Wellington clapped her hands together. "Well, that's certainly an improvement. Grace, dear, make sure you clean all that hair up before my bridge club arrives at noon. We can't have the house looking messy. Grace, there's fresh towels in the linen closet. You can clean yourself up in the powder room, but please don't take too long. I need you to prepare lunch for my friends." These people who lived in luxury, built on inherited wealth, had just humiliated her for their own amusement, and they expected her to clean up the evidence and serve them lunch afterward. But what Thomas Wellington III would discover when he returned home from his office that evening was that Grace Kimani was not the helpless, uneducated woman his family believed her to be. And the smartphone in her pocket had recorded every second of his son's attack and his wife's encouragement, creating evidence that would either destroy the Wellington family's reputation completely or force them to face consequences they had never imagined possible. As Grace began picking up the pieces of her hair from the Persian rug, her mind was already calculating exactly how much this moment of cruelty was going to cost the Wellington family. Because the woman they had just humiliated possessed knowledge and connections that could unravel their entire financial empire, and she had just decided that being invisible was no longer an option. The first phase of Grace's plan began immediately. While Margaret Wellington showered and Brandon played video games in his room, Grace carefully collected every strand of her cut hair and placed it in a plastic bag. She took detailed photographs of the uneven, butchered mess Brandon had made of her head, making sure the expensive Wellington living room was visible in the background. The timestamp on her phone clearly showed the incident had occurred during her scheduled work hours in their home. But the haircutting was just the beginning. Grace's smartphone had been recording audio since she arrived that morning, a habit she had developed after working for wealthy families who liked to blame missing items or damage on their domestic staff. The recording captured Brandon's words about his mother's instructions, Margaret's laughter and encouragement, and their casual discussion about keeping Grace home from school to avoid consequences. Grace locked herself in the powder room and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the dignified professional who had once closed million-dollar real estate deals in Nairobi. Her hair looked like it had been attacked with a lawnmower, and her eyes showed the hollow shock of someone processing a profound betrayal. She pulled out her smartphone and opened an encrypted messaging app, typing a message in fluent Mandarin Chinese. "Li Wei, I need you to verify ownership documents for Wellington properties. All subsidiaries, shell companies, and international holdings. Priority 1. They had maintained their friendship over the years, and Li Wei had often offered Grace positions that would utilize her actual skills and education. But Grace had always declined, focusing on survival in America rather than career advancement. Grace typed back, "Send me everything you can find on Wellington family assets, personal and business. I need a complete financial profile. Give me 2 hours." What they didn't realize was that Grace understood every word of their conversations about property acquisitions, international investments, and tax avoidance strategies. At 11:30 a.m., her phone buzzed with an incoming message from Li Wei, containing detailed financial reports on Wellington properties. Grace's eyes widened as she scrolled through the information. The Wellington Empire was far more vulnerable than anyone realized. Thomas Wellington III had leveraged the family's assets heavily to finance an aggressive expansion into Chinese real estate markets. But the recent economic slowdown had left several projects underwater. The family's liquid cash was much lower than their public image suggested, and they were dependent on continuous revenue from their Manhattan properties to service their debt. More importantly, Li Wei had identified several irregularities in the Wellington's international filings, discrepancies between their reported income to American tax authorities and their actual earnings from Chinese investments. The kind of discrepancies that would interest the IRS and potentially lead to fraud investigations. But Grace's attention was caught by something else in the financial reports. Wellington Properties had been trying to acquire a specific block of Manhattan real estate for 8 years. The same block where Grace's former employer in Kenya, Kimani Development Group, had purchased significant holdings just before Grace emigrated to America. Property that was now worth $200 million and currently tied up in probate court because the company's founder, Grace's former mentor, James Kimani, had died without updating his will to reflect his American investments. Grace's hands began trembling as she realized the implications. James Kimani had been like a father to her during her years at his company in Nairobi. He had mentored her through her early career, taught her everything about international real estate law, and had always spoken of her as the daughter he never had. When she left Kenya, he had promised to help her establish herself in America once she got settled. But James had died in a car accident 6 months after Grace emigrated, and she had been too consumed with survival in New York to follow up on the complex legal proceedings surrounding his estate. She assumed his wife and children would inherit everything and had felt too guilty about abandoning her career to contact the family about her mentor's American investments. Grace quickly called the probate attorney handling James Kimani's estate in Manhattan. After 20 minutes on hold and several transfers, she finally reached someone who could access the files. "Ms. Kimani? Yes, we've been trying to reach you for years. James Kimani's will specifically names you as the primary beneficiary for all American real estate holdings. He updated the will just 1 week before his death, stating that you were the only person with the expertise and integrity to manage his American investments properly. The estate has been in probate limbo because we couldn't locate you to finalize the transfer. What exactly did he leave to me?" For 2 years, she had been scrubbing the floors of people who were trying to acquire property that she actually owned. She had been living in poverty in Queens while she was actually one of Manhattan's largest property owners. The attorney continued, "There are some complications with several properties currently under litigation. Wellington Properties has been challenging our ownership claims and trying to force a sale through various legal maneuvers. But with you available to claim your inheritance, we can finally proceed with defending your rights." Kimani's records. "Today, do you have documentation of your employment with his company? And I have some additional evidence that might interest you regarding Wellington Properties' business practices." But she also carried something else: the smartphone containing recordings of Brandon Wellington's assault and his family's casual cruelty, evidence that would provide her with additional leverage in the legal battle ahead. The attorney, Michael Chen, spent 3 hours reviewing Grace's documents and listening to her account of the morning's events. By 5 p.m., he was shaking his head in amazement. "Ms. Kimani, in 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen a case quite like this. You're not just the rightful heir to a significant real estate portfolio, You're also the victim of what appears to be systematic harassment and assault by the very people who've been trying to steal your property. The recordings you've provided demonstrate a pattern of behavior that would be devastating to the Wellington family if made public. James Kimani's will specifically states that he left these properties to you because he believed you had the intelligence and strength to build something significant in America. He wrote that he had watched you overcome every challenge with dignity and strategic thinking, and that he was confident you would honor his legacy. James had seen something in her that she had almost forgotten during her years of invisible servitude in American homes. What are our options? Grace asked. We have several paths forward. First, we immediately file all necessary paperwork to establish your legal claim to the inherited properties. Wellington Properties' attempts to acquire them become null and void once your ownership is confirmed. Second, we can pursue criminal charges against Brandon Wellington for assault and civil charges against the family for harassment and creating a hostile work environment. Given the financial irregularities leeway identified in Wellington Properties' international dealings and the evidence you've gathered of their character and business practices, we could pursue a more comprehensive approach. Or they can agree to sell you their remaining Manhattan properties at fair market value, allowing you to consolidate the entire block of real estate they've been pursuing for years. The Wellington Properties portfolio would give you control of 12 city blocks in Manhattan. You would go from cleaning houses to owning some of the most valuable real estate in America. If the Wellingtons cooperate and agree to negotiate, we could have initial agreements within 48 hours. If they choose to fight, well, federal investigations into tax fraud can take years, and the publicity from your assault case would destroy their social standing long before any trial concluded. But I want to present it to them personally. Instead, he found Grace sitting at his dining room table, her hair still hidden under a headscarf, with a briefcase open in front of her, and a serious-looking man in an expensive suit sitting beside her. "What the hell is this?" Thomas demanded. "Grace, you're supposed to be finished and gone by now. And who is this man in my home?" "My name is Grace Kimani, and I need to discuss some business with you. This is my attorney, Michael Chen. We have several matters to discuss, starting with your company's attempts to acquire property that belongs to me. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you out." He knew exactly which properties the attorney was referring to. The block of real estate that Wellington Properties needed to complete their largest development project. The same properties tied up in probate court that his legal team had been fighting to acquire through various legal challenges. "That's impossible," Thomas said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "The Kimani heir hasn't been located. Those properties are in legal limbo. Wellington, your son physically assaulted me in your home this morning, while your wife watched and laughed. This recording, along with photographs of the injuries he inflicted, provides clear evidence of hate crime and assault charges. But the assault is actually the least of your family's problems. Wellington, we've also identified significant discrepancies between your company's reported income to American tax authorities and your actual earnings from Chinese investments. These irregularities suggest tax fraud in the range of $50 million over the past 5 years. What do you want?" he whispered. Grace leaned forward, her voice steady and professional. "I want justice, Mr. Wellington. For 2 years, I cleaned your toilets and scrubbed your floors while you tried to steal property that belonged to me. This morning, your family humiliated me for entertainment, assuming I was powerless to defend myself. You were wrong. You can face criminal charges for your son's assault, civil rights violations, and federal investigation for tax fraud. The publicity alone would destroy your family's reputation and business relationships. You can use the proceeds to satisfy your Chinese debts and relocate your business operations. Your family avoids prosecution and public scandal, and you can start over somewhere else. Combining your Manhattan holdings with mine would give me control of one of the largest real estate portfolios in the city. We met this morning when your son assaulted me. Wellington, your laughter and encouragement make you an accessory to the assault. She's also recorded our son's assault this morning and discovered our tax issues with the Chinese investments. I've been working as your housekeeper because I needed immediate income, not because I lacked other options. I've also maintained professional relationships with international investors who are very interested in acquiring Manhattan real estate. You have 48 hours to decide, Grace continued. Accept my offer to purchase your properties at fair market value, or face the consequences of your actions in criminal court and federal tax investigation. Either way, I will never clean another toilet in this house. And why is the cleaning lady still here? You should be thanking me. In New York State, those charges carry potential sentences of up to 7 years in prison, especially for attacks motivated by racial bias. Please, there must be something we can do. Brandon's just a child. He didn't understand. There are consequences for cruelty. What happens to Brandon? The alternative: criminal prosecution, tax fraud investigation, and social destruction would leave them with nothing. At least Grace's offer would provide them with enough money to start over somewhere else. We accept, he said. Grace and Michael Chen spent the next hour outlining the terms of the property transfer. The Wellington family would sell their Manhattan holdings to Grace at fair market value, approximately $320 million, which would give Grace control of over $500 million in New York real estate. The Wellington family would pay Grace an additional $2 million in damages for the hostile work environment and assault, and they would relocate outside of New York State within 3 months. As they finalized the initial agreements, Grace received a text message from Li Wei. Grace, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. If you're serious about getting back into real estate development, my firm would be very interested in partnering with you on Manhattan projects. We have $800 million available for American real estate investment. Kimani, with Chinese investment partnership, you'd have over $1 billion available for development projects. You could reshape entire neighborhoods in Manhattan. I don't think he imagined it would happen quite like this, but he was right. Li Wei had arrived from Beijing the previous week, and their partnership had already identified 12 development opportunities across Manhattan. Grace's intimate knowledge of the city's real estate patterns, combined with Li Wei's access to international capital, was creating investment opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. The morning news was playing on the wall-mounted television, featuring a story about the Wellington family's departure from New York. Thomas Wellington III had issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging inappropriate treatment of a valued employee and announcing the family's relocation to Arizona to pursue new opportunities. The statement included a $500,000 donation to the International Rescue Committee's programs supporting immigrant workers. Brandon Wellington was enrolled in a residential program for troubled teenagers in Arizona, where he would spend the next 2 years learning about the consequences of his actions. Margaret Wellington had quietly filed for divorce and was living in her sister's guest house in Phoenix, working as a receptionist at a medical clinic, the first paying job she had held in 15 years. Grace's assistant knocked on the office door. Ms. Kimani, your mother is on the phone from Nairobi. But Grace, I've been reading the American newspapers online. They say you've become a very important businesswoman in New York. Is this true? And I've learned that sometimes the people who treat you worst accidentally give you the motivation to become everything you were meant to be. I'm already working on that. Grace opened her laptop and began typing an email to the directors of immigrant services organizations throughout New York City. She was announcing a new program. Kimani Development Group would provide business loans, mentorship, and employment opportunities specifically for educated immigrants whose professional credentials weren't recognized in America. The program would be called the Invisible No More Initiative and would focus on identifying domestic workers, food service employees, and other service industry workers who possessed advanced degrees and professional experience from their home countries. Grace would provide them with the resources to recertify their credentials, start their own businesses, or transition into careers that matched their actual skills and education. Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Ms. Kimani, this is Sarah Martinez. I clean offices in the Wellington building downtown. I heard about what happened to the Wellington family and wanted you to know. I have a master's degree in engineering from Mexico City. If your company ever needs someone who understands construction and building systems, I would love to talk. Grace scheduled interviews with all of them for the following week. 3 months later, Grace stood on the construction site of her first major development project, a 40-story mixed-use building in Queens, that would provide affordable housing for 200 immigrant families, while also housing the headquarters of Kimani Development Group. The building's chief engineer was Sarah Martinez, the former office cleaner who had texted Grace that first day. The project manager was Dr. Ahmad Hassan, a former heart surgeon from Syria who had been working as a hospital janitor while studying for his American medical recertification exams. Li Wei joined Grace on the construction site, both of them wearing hard hats and reviewing the latest progress reports. Grace, I have to admit, when you first contacted me about verifying Wellington Properties documents, I thought you were just doing due diligence for a small legal issue. I never imagined it would lead to this. Wellington Properties has officially filed for bankruptcy in Arizona. Thomas Wellington III lost everything trying to service the Chinese debts without his Manhattan revenue. Their Arizona properties are being liquidated to pay creditors. Learning about other cultures, volunteering with immigrant families. The program director says he's become one of their success stories. Thomas Wellington has agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced penalties. He's also agreed to testify about other Manhattan real estate companies that may be using similar tax avoidance schemes. Your restraint may have prevented other families from being victimized by similar schemes. 6 months later, Grace received an unexpected letter delivered to her office. The return address showed it was from Brandon Wellington in Arizona. Dear Ms. Kimani, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you after what I did, but my counselor says I should try to make amends to the people I've hurt. I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. Not just the hair cutting, but everything about how my family treated you and people like you. I've been volunteering at a refugee center here in Arizona, helping families from Somalia and Sudan get settled. Working with them has taught me things about courage and dignity that I never learned in my expensive private school. I also wanted you to know that I've been learning Swahili. One of the refugees here is from Kenya, and she's been teaching me about East African culture. I understand now that when I cut your hair, I wasn't just hurting you physically. I was attacking something sacred about your heritage and identity. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm spending every day trying to become the kind of person who would never do something like that again. I read about your company in the news and about all the immigrants you're helping. I think what you're doing is amazing. I hope someday I can do something that helps people too. Sincerely, Brandon Wellington. Grace dictated a response to her assistant. Dear Brandon, thank you for your letter. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes and work to become better. The fact that you're learning Swahili and volunteering with refugee families tells me that you're serious about changing. My grandmother used to say that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they learn from them. Keep learning, keep helping others, and keep growing. The world needs people who can transform their regrets into positive action. Sincerely, Grace Kimani. When I arrived in America 8 years ago, Grace told the audience, I believed that success meant becoming invisible, working hard, keeping quiet, and being grateful for whatever opportunities I could find. I spent years cleaning the homes of people who never bothered to learn my name, convinced that invisibility was the price of survival in a new country. It's accepting that your dreams, your education, your potential, and your dignity are worth less than someone else's comfort. I'm here to tell you that you were not meant to be invisible. In the past year, our company has helped 847 immigrants transition from service jobs into careers that match their education and skills. We've provided business loans to 156 immigrant entrepreneurs who are now employing over 3,000 people in New York City. We've built housing for 100 to 200 immigrant families and established partnerships with universities to help professionals recertify their international credentials. But the most important thing we've accomplished is this. We've proven that immigrant success isn't just good for immigrants, it's good for America. The engineers, doctors, teachers, and business leaders in this room didn't take jobs away from American workers. You created jobs, you built businesses. You solved problems that American companies couldn't solve alone. And most importantly, you matter. Kimani Development Group would be expanding to other cities soon, and she would need their expertise to make it successful. 2 years after the incident that changed her life, Grace received a phone call that surprised her. Margaret Wellington was calling from Arizona. "Grace?" Margaret's voice was hesitant and humble. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling you. I wanted to thank you. Thomas and I are divorced now, but that's probably for the best. I'm working as a counselor at a women's shelter, helping women who've left abusive relationships. It's the first time in my adult life that I've had a job that actually helps people. I've spent 2 years in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could find cruelty amusing. I think I was so dependent on wealth and status that I forgot how to see other people as human beings." He wants to work with refugee families after he graduates. The boy who cut your hair is becoming a man who wants to help people like you succeed in America. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your decision to show us mercy instead of revenge taught my son something about real strength that he never could have learned any other way. But perhaps more importantly, she had changed the lives of the people who had hurt her, transforming their cruelty into compassion and their prejudice into understanding. Grace opened her computer and began working on plans for Kimani Development Group's next project, a partnership with Arizona State University to create internship programs for students studying social work with immigrant families. Brandon Wellington's application would receive fair consideration alongside all the other applicants. 3 years after Grace Kimani cleaned her last toilet, she stood in the White House Rose Garden as President Harris presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to immigrant entrepreneurship and community development. In the audience sat her mother and sister, who had moved to New York and were now both American citizens. Also in the audience was Lee Wei, who had relocated permanently to New York to expand their real estate partnership, and Dr. Ahmad Hassan, who had completed his medical recertification and now ran a free clinic for immigrants in Queens. And in the back row, almost hidden among the other guests, sat Brandon Wellington, now 21 years old and about to graduate from Arizona State University with a degree in social work and international relations. He had driven 12 hours from Arizona to attend the ceremony, wanting to witness the recognition of the woman whose dignity and strength had changed the course of his life. After the ceremony, Brandon approached Grace hesitantly. "Ms. Kimani, I don't know if you remember me. Kimani, I need you to know that every day for the past 3 years, I've thought about what I did to you. Not just the haircutting, but the person I was, someone who thought other people existed for my amusement. I've spent 3 years learning about immigrants and refugees, volunteering with families who've overcome incredible challenges, and I finally understand what my counselor meant when he said I needed to learn the difference between power and strength. These kids have taught me more about courage and determination than I learned in 16 years of private school," Brandon continued. "They've fled war, learned a new language, and they're succeeding in American schools despite incredible obstacles. Working with them made me realize that true strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about using whatever privileges you have to lift other people up." She said that the most important moment in a person's life isn't when they succeed. It's when they choose to use their success to help someone else succeed. You've clearly learned that lesson. We're expanding our family services division, and we need people who understand both the challenges immigrants face and the privilege that comes with being born American. The person standing in front of me now is a young man who has spent 3 years learning about justice, compassion, and service to others. Those are the qualifications I care about. What matters is whether you've learned from your mistakes and chosen to become better. His bilingual skills in Spanish and Arabic, developed during his volunteer work in Arizona, made him particularly valuable for working with families from Latin America and the Middle East. On his first day of work, Brandon was assigned to help a Somali family find housing in Queens. As he drove them around the city, showing them apartments and explaining American rental procedures, the father asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Brandon, you speak very good Arabic for an American. Where did you learn our language?" "I made some serious mistakes when I was younger. I treated immigrants badly because I didn't understand their strength and contributions. Learning your language was part of my education about the kind of person I wanted to become. In my country, we have a saying, 'The tree that bends in the storm survives, while the rigid tree breaks.' You have learned to bend. Brandon, Authenticity is one of the most important qualities in this work. The families we serve have overcome tremendous challenges, and they can recognize when someone is genuine versus when someone is just going through the motions. The fact that you chose honesty over convenience tells me you're going to be very good at this job. Honorable delegates, Grace addressed the assembly. When we talk about immigration policy, we often focus on the challenges immigrants create for receiving countries. Today, I want to talk about the opportunities we're missing when we fail to recognize the talents and potential that immigrants bring. In America, immigrants are twice as likely as native-born citizens to start businesses. They create jobs at higher rates, file patents at higher rates, and contribute billions of dollars in taxes every year. But these statistics only capture the immigrants who manage to overcome systemic barriers to recognition and opportunity. The woman speaking to you today spent 2 years cleaning toilets in Manhattan while possessing advanced degrees in finance and real estate law. I am not unusual. In every major city in America, there are thousands of immigrants working jobs that dramatically underutilize their education and skills. This represents not just a personal tragedy for those individuals, but an enormous economic loss for the receiving countries. The countries that figure out how to quickly recognize and utilize immigrant talents will have significant competitive advantages in the global economy. The countries that continue to waste those talents will fall behind. The program she had developed in New York, identifying underutilized immigrant professionals and providing pathways to career advancement, was being studied by governments around the world as a model for economic development. But the conversation that meant the most to Grace came from an unexpected source. Margaret Wellington, now 50 years old and working as the director of a women's shelter in Phoenix, had traveled to New York to attend Grace's UN presentation. "Grace," Margaret said as they sat in Grace's office overlooking Manhattan, "I wanted to be here today because listening to you speak reminded me of something important. When I first met you, I saw a housekeeper. When you returned to our home with your attorney, I saw a threat to everything I thought my family deserved. But today, listening to you address world leaders about human dignity and economic justice, I finally see who you actually are. And the most remarkable thing is that you became that force, not despite what my family did to you, but in some ways because of it. We gave you a choice between revenge and justice, and you chose justice. That choice didn't just change our lives, it's changing the world." Margaret, I think what happened between our families taught me something important about power. Real power isn't about controlling other people or taking revenge on people who hurt you. Real power is about creating systems that prevent other people from being hurt the same way. Every building we construct includes affordable housing for immigrant families. Every business loan we provide creates jobs for other immigrants. Every success story from our program proves that immigrants are assets, not burdens. That's more powerful than any revenge I could have taken on your family. He's marrying a woman named Amara. She's a refugee from Ethiopia, who's now studying to become a doctor. They met while he was helping her family navigate the healthcare system for her grandfather's cancer treatment. Amara knows the whole story about what Brandon did to you. And she says that watching him work every day to become worthy of the second chance you gave him is what convinced her he was the right person to marry. I would be honored to attend Brandon's wedding. The wedding was a beautiful blend of cultures, American traditions mixed with Ethiopian coffee ceremonies, and Somali wedding songs performed by children from the refugee center where Brandon had volunteered. In her wedding speech, Amara addressed Grace directly. "Ms. Kimani, Brandon has told me the story of how he wronged you and how you chose to respond with justice rather than revenge. As someone who came to America as a refugee, I want you to know that your example of transforming pain into purpose has inspired not just Brandon, but thousands of immigrants who have heard your story. You have shown us that success in America isn't about becoming American. It's about becoming the best version of ourselves." Brandon had completed his master's degree in social work and was planning to pursue a PhD in immigration policy. Amara was considering specializing in providing medical care for refugee children. "Ms. Kimani?" Brandon said. "Amara and I have been talking about something, and we wanted to ask your advice. We're thinking about starting a nonprofit organization that would provide comprehensive services for refugee families. Not just immediate needs like housing and food, but long-term support for education, career development, and civic engagement. Brandon's experience working with your company has taught him about the importance of helping immigrants achieve their potential rather than just survive. And I think Kimani Development Group would be very interested in providing funding and partnership for that kind of program. It sounds like you've both identified a real problem and developed a passion for solving it. That's the foundation of any successful nonprofit. But the chapter that resonated most with readers was titled The Gift of Consequences, which told the story of Brandon Wellington's transformation from privileged racist teenager to refugee advocate and loving husband to an Ethiopian immigrant. In that chapter, Grace wrote, "People often ask me if I regret not pursuing criminal charges against the family that humiliated me. They assume that mercy is the same as weakness and that justice requires punishment. But I learned something important from that experience. The most powerful form of justice isn't punishment, it's transformation. When we respond to cruelty with consequences that teach rather than simply punish, we create the possibility for people to become better than they were." Their 3 children are growing up bilingual and bicultural, learning that diversity is strength and that every person has value, regardless of where they were born. That transformation didn't happen because I was kind to Brandon. It happened because I gave him consequences that forced him to confront the reality of his actions and choose who he wanted to become. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone who has wronged us is the opportunity to earn redemption. Over 2 decades, her foundation had provided full university scholarships to over 5,000 immigrant students, many of whom had gone on to become doctors, engineers, teachers, and business leaders. One application caught her attention. Zara Wellington Hassan, age 17, daughter of Brandon Wellington and Dr. Amara Hassan. Zara's essay was titled, "Growing Up Between Worlds: How My Parents' Love Story Taught Me About Justice and Redemption." My mother tells me stories about fleeing Ethiopia as a refugee and struggling to build a new life in America. She tells me these stories not to make me feel guilty about my comfortable life, but to help me understand that dignity and determination can overcome any obstacle. She has taught me that true strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about using whatever advantages you have to lift other people up. She has also taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't wrong. Forgiveness means choosing to see people's potential for growth rather than defining them forever by their worst moments. I am the daughter of someone who once committed a hate crime and someone who was once a refugee. That combination has taught me that every person contains the capacity for both cruelty and compassion, and that our job as human beings is to choose compassion and help others make the same choice. The teenager applying for her scholarship was the daughter of the boy who had cut her hair 20 years ago, and she was also one of the most thoughtful and articulate young people Grace had ever encountered. Grace immediately approved Zara's scholarship application and made a note to herself to offer Zara an internship at Kimani Development Group the following summer. That evening, Grace called Brandon and Amara to congratulate them on their daughter's scholarship. "Brandon," she said, "I need you to know that reading Zara's essay reminded me why I chose justice over revenge 20 years ago. Your daughter is going to change the world, and she's going to do it because you and Amara taught her that everyone deserves dignity and everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were." Grace, Amara and I have tried to raise our children to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, and that the most important thing you can do with a second chance is make sure other people get second chances too. We learned that from watching you. At 67 years old, she was recognized as one of the most influential business leaders of the early 21st century, but more importantly, as someone who had transformed the way the world thought about immigration, opportunity, and human potential. Graduates, Grace addressed the audience. You're entering a world that will be shaped by migration and cultural exchange more than any generation in human history. The challenges you will face: climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, cannot be solved by any one country or culture alone. They require the kind of collaboration and innovation that only comes from bringing together diverse perspectives and experiences. The woman speaking to you today owns billions of dollars in real estate and has helped thousands of immigrants achieve their dreams in America. That transformation happened not because I was special, but because someone believed in my potential, and because I refused to accept that invisibility was my destiny. In this audience today, there are students whose parents cleaned offices while possessing advanced degrees from universities in their home countries. There are students whose families fled wars and persecution and rebuilt their lives in new countries through determination and hard work. There are students whose grandparents or parents made serious mistakes, but chose to learn from those mistakes and become better people. Some of you will face greater challenges than others, but all of you have the power to choose whether you use your experiences to lift others up or to tear others down. Because when we stop making people invisible, we discover that human potential is unlimited. But she lived long enough to see me graduate from MIT with a degree in chemical engineering. I wanted you to know that your story gave her hope that my generation would have different opportunities than hers did. I would love to talk with you about opportunities in our company's environmental engineering division. But more than her own success, she thought about the thousands of immigrants whose lives had been changed by the programs and opportunities created by Kimani Development Group. She thought about Brandon Wellington, now 41 years old and running one of the most successful refugee resettlement organizations in America. She thought about Dr. Amara Hassan, whose pediatric clinic provided free medical care to immigrant children across 3 states. She thought about their 3 children, all of whom spoke multiple languages and spent their summers volunteering with refugee families. She thought about Thomas Wellington III, who had quietly spent his final years volunteering at a homeless shelter in Phoenix, never seeking recognition for his service, but dedicating himself to helping people who had lost everything rebuild their lives. He had died 2 years ago, and his obituary made no mention of his former wealth or business empire, only his work with homeless veterans and his dedication to his family. Grace thought about Margaret Wellington, now the director of a network of women's shelters across Arizona, who had become a nationally recognized expert on helping women escape domestic violence and rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. But most of all, Grace thought about the simple truth that had driven every decision she had made for the past 25 years. Everyone deserves the chance to become the best version of themselves. And the most powerful thing you can do with success is use it to help other people succeed. As Grace reached her car, her phone buzzed with a text message from Zara Wellington Hassan. Master, Kimani, thank you for showing my family that justice is more powerful than revenge, and that love is more powerful than hate. I start my job with the UN Refugee Agency next month, and I promise to honor everything you taught us about dignity, opportunity, and human potential. His children were growing up to become global leaders in human rights and international development. And somewhere in America, other immigrants who had been invisible were discovering their own potential and transforming their communities in ways that honored the dignity and dreams of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Grace Kimani had learned that the most powerful response to injustice wasn't revenge. It was building a world where justice was possible for everyone. And that work would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by the thousands of people whose lives had been changed by her example of transforming pain into purpose and invisibility into influence. The story of the African housekeeper who became a billionaire real estate mogul was really the story of what becomes possible when people refuse to accept that anyone's potential should remain invisible.